Welcome all viewers to our channel. We are glad to see you here, where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us and we will be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. Now let's move on to our first story. Chicago's South Side is a neighborhood of contrasts. The narrow streets here are filled with the lively hum of street markets, the sounds of cars, and the screams of children playing basketball on rusty rings. But behind these sounds of everyday life lies another side, the ominous whispers of gangsters, the sirens of police cars, and the echoing gunshots that shatter the silence at night. Marcus Brayson grew up in one of the small brick houses in this part of town. The house was modest, faded curtains on the windows, a small yard with a single apple tree, but his family always tried to make it a warm place. They lived poorly, but friendly. His mother, a nurse, worked 2 jobs to feed her 3 children. And his father worked part-time as a mechanic when he was home, trying to find time to raise his sons. From childhood, Markjus was different. While his older brother Lamont dreamed of becoming a professional basketball player, and his younger sister Dina was always drawing and dreamed of becoming an artist, Markjus was drawn to music. His first toy was his father's old radio. When he could barely walk, he would turn the knobs and listen to everything: jazz, soul, rap, rock. One day, on his 5th birthday, his father brought home a shabby acoustic guitar he found at a garage sale. "It's for you, son. It may be old, but the music in it is alive," he said, smiling. Markjus would sit in the yard for long periods of time, fumbling with the strings, trying to pick out melodies. His little fingers would not listen, but he persevered. One day a neighbor, Mr. Hayes, an old man with a gray beard who played at the local church, noticed the boy. "Hey, kid, let me show you how to play this instrument," he offered. From then on, Mr. Hayes became his first teacher. He showed chords, taught him how to feel the music, not just play. Music isn't just the sounds, it's the story you tell. If your music doesn't evoke emotion, then you're doing something wrong, he said. As a teenager, Markjus' life confronted him with the harsh realities of the neighborhood. Gangs tried to lure him into their ranks. "You're a street kid," one of the ringleaders, Kevin, told him. "You're either with us or against us." But Markjus knew this path was not for him. He had seen guys die who had once just tried it. Instead, he found his refuge in music. On the streets, he would gather a group of kids and teenagers to improvise together. They used everything: old drums found in the dump, pieces of pipe to make rhythm. Some had a synthesizer, others had a broken microphone, but out of it came a vibrant energy. Markjus began to write songs. His lyrics were full of pain and hope. They spoke of what he saw every day, of mothers who worked to exhaustion to save their children, of lost friends, of dreams to escape poverty. His talent began to attract attention. He had a full house at school concerts, and one day he was invited to perform at a local festival. His track "Hard Times Don't Last" became a hit among young people in the neighborhood. "He sings our lives," it was said of him. His name became known not only in the neighborhood. People saw him as a symbol of hope, a man who showed that it was possible to get out of poverty without losing oneself. Markjus became an inspiration to others. He organized free workshops for teenagers, teaching them how to write music and not to be afraid to dream. "Your life is not defined by your neighborhood. Music is a way to tell your story to the world," he said. After raising some money, he set up a small recording studio so that local kids could record their tracks. This place became a haven for talented young people. By the age of 25, Markjus had released his first album. It was called Voices of the Streets. The album became popular not only in Chicago, but also outside Chicago. His songs were played on the radio, discussed in the newspapers, but Markjus wasn't leaving the neighborhood. He said, "If I leave, who's gonna tell about us? Who will inspire the kids here in these neighborhoods?" Marcus Brayson became more than just a musician. He became a symbol of Chicago's South Side, a place that taught people to fight for their dreams. The chapter ends with a description of Markjus performing to a crowd of young people in a local park. He stands with his guitar, illuminated by the dim light of the street lamps. His voice sounds confident, his guitar sings, and the crowd listens breathlessly. There is a light of hope in his eyes, and the people below realize, this man is an example of how art can change lives. On this positive note, the story pauses, before moving on to the events that would change Markjus' fate forever. It was one of those evenings when life seemed especially easy. It was a hot summer in Chicago, but it was softened by a cool breeze carrying the smell of freshly baked goods from the local bakery. Markjus spent the day in his studio, a cozy space on the first floor of an old brick building where the walls were covered with graffiti and the beat he'd just created played softly from the speakers. His new track promised to be something special. In it, Markjus tried to express his sense of gratitude for all the difficulties he had overcome. His lyrics pulsed with life, and the melody, a mix of jazz and hip-hop, was unusually catchy. "Bro, it's a hit," said his friend and sound engineer Daryl as they made the final edits. "I'm sure people on the streets will be humming it in a week." Markjus laughed, picking up a paper cup of coffee. "Here's to that." The sun was already setting, coloring the streets golden and orange. When Markjus stepped out of the studio, he slipped his black hoodie over his shoulders, pulled up his hood, and slung his backpack and laptop on his back. The headphones around his neck played a demo of a new track, and he bobbed his head to the beat of the music as he walked down the sidewalk. The streets were lively, the little benches were still open, the children were playing ball in the playground, the passers-by were hurrying home. Markjus knew these streets like the back of his hand. He knew every other person in the neighborhood. "Hey, Markjus, when's the new track?" shouted to him from his bike. "Soon, buddy, just be patient," he smiled back. But the closer he got to his neighborhood, the more he sensed that something fishy was in the air. At an intersection 2 blocks away, he noticed a crowd of people crowded around 2 police cars. Blue and red lights flashed, illuminating the evening street. Passers-by were whispering, and some were filming on their phones. Something must have happened again, Markjus thought, trying not to pay much attention to it. He turned the other way, trying to get around the cluster of people, but then he heard loud voices. "Hands in the air, get down on the ground," a policeman shouted sharply. Marcus stopped, his heart beat faster. He froze, trying to figure out what was happening, but everything seemed chaotic. Screams, flickering figures, shrill sirens. Suddenly, someone shouted, "It's him, he fits the description." Before Marcus realized what was happening, 2 policemen ran up to him. One of them grabbed him by the shoulder and turned him around, while the other was already handcuffing him. "Get down on the ground," shouted one of the officers. "Hey, wait, I didn't do anything." Markjus tried to object, but his hands were clasped behind his back. His backpack and laptop fell to the sidewalk. "You're a suspect in the shooting. You fit the description," the other policeman said emotionlessly. Marcus tried to explain himself. "Wait, I was just in the studio. I'm a musician. I don't have a gun. Check my records." But his words dissolved into noise. One of the policemen pressed his face against the hood of the patrol car, twisting the handcuffs so tightly that they dug into his wrists. Passers-by began to scream, "It's Marcus Brayson. He couldn't have done it. Leave him alone. Don't interfere." One of the officers cut them off, giving them a threatening look. Marcus felt rage mingle with helplessness. His face flamed with humiliation. He couldn't believe this was happening to him. "Why do they think I'm a criminal? Just because I'm black? Because I have a hood? You have no right," he shouted, but it only made things worse. One of the officers pushed him harder, pinning him to the ground with his knee. "Quiet or it will get worse," the policeman hissed. The whole world seemed to shrink to that one moment, the cold of the asphalt beneath his cheeks, the metallic taste of blood in his mouth from a split lip, the screams of the people around him who couldn't help him. He was seated in a patrol car. Through the fogged window, he could see the faces of people standing along the street. Some were taking videos on their phones, others were shouting his name. Markjus closed his eyes, trying to take his mind off everything. "It's a mistake. They'll realize it's a mistake," he repeated to himself like a mantra, but deep inside, there was a fear. What if they didn't? As the car touched down, he turned around and saw his backpack, left on the sidewalk, being picked up by a teenager in the crowd. Markjus hoped he would keep it. His whole life was in there. Tracks, lyrics, records. At the police station, Marcus felt small and helpless. They put him in a cold cell, not answering questions or allowing him to explain himself. He stared at the cracked walls, remembering his mother, who had always taught him to be strong, no matter how cruel the world was. But now he felt broken. His music, his name, his reputation, all of it could disappear because of one mistaken suspicion. The night seemed endless. There was one phrase in my head, You fit the description. The chapter ends with a scene where Markjus sits alone on a bench in his cell, his hands clenched in handcuffs. Through the bars he can see the dim light of the morning sun, which seems unnaturally distant. He realizes that this night is only the beginning of an ordeal that could change his life forever. Evening had long since turned to night, and Marcus continued to sit in his cold cell, clutching his handcuffs to the point of pain. The walls were stained with dirt, and condensation dripped in small drops in the corner of the cell. He felt isolated from the world, from his friends, his family, and the life he was building through his music. Footsteps sounded, the door opened, and an officer named Detective Hansen entered the cell, an old and ruthless policeman with a stern face and eyes full of contempt. He was known for his personal prejudices rather than the law. "Get up, Brayson," he shouted, not even giving Marcus a chance to get up himself. The officer roughly pulled him to his feet and began dragging him down the corridor of the station. Hansen led Markjus to an interrogation room with a table and 2 hard metal chairs. The room was dim, with a single lamp in the center that cast harsh shadows. "Tell me what you were doing tonight. Why were you seen in that neighborhood?" Hansen asked, leaning too close to him. Marcus tried to speak, but his voice trembled. "I was coming home from the studio. I'm a musician. I have records. Check my cell phones, my laptop." "Oh, a musician, huh?" The officer grinned, throwing his head back. "You think your tracks will clear up suspicion? We got streets here, son, not studios. I've seen your kind. You fit the description." That phrase, "fit the description," hit him over the head like a hammer. Marcus knew what it meant: preconceived police stereotypes that were not based on facts and required no proof. Only skin color, age, and clothing became grounds for suspicion. The next interrogation was conducted by Detectives Clark and Miller. They sat down across from Marcus and began asking questions in which their bias was obvious. "Where were you at 9 p.m.? Why were you seen in the neighborhood where the shooting occurred?" Miller asked, holding up a printed photo that captured Markjus at some point as he casually walked past another neighborhood. "I was in the studio," Markjus repeated. "Check the tapes. My friends are in there. We've been working on a new track." "The studio." "Yeah," Clark grinned. "You expect us to believe that studio? We have our sources. Kid, it's easy to see who's a man of the streets and who isn't." The policemen were rude and dismissive, turning Marcus into a victim of their preconceived assumptions. His every question became an accusation and his attempts to explain himself a waste of time. Each interrogation was an emotional ordeal. Markjus felt his dignity eroding. The humiliation began with brute physical force and psychological pressure, but deep down he felt that in this neighborhood, in the eyes of these officers, he was just another suspicious figure. In a parallel room where the officers were discussing the case, they talked about Markjus as if he were not a person but a problem. "It's easier for us to know right away that he's here for a reason," Hansen told his partner. "We have to act fast. Race in the street will tell us more than these interrogations. If he's off the streets, that means he's involved in something. We're just scratching out the extra steps," Miller replied. These conversations showed that the police in the neighborhood were not acting according to the law, but through a racial prism and personal stereotypes. Working in the precinct was simplified through preconceived notions of who could be a criminal and who could not. To the officers, Markjus was not a musician, but simply a figure on the streets, a potential criminal who deserved no respect. During this time, sitting in the interrogation room, Marcus tried to keep his mind clear. He remembered his friends from the studio, those who had supported him even in the most difficult times. He saw the faces of those who believed in his talent, those who were inspired by his songs. He thought of his mother who worked hard every day to feed the family, of his brother Lamont who dreamed of a better future but was already caught in the clutches of the streets. "No, I won't give up," he whispered. "I must prove them wrong. I'm not a criminal. I'm not dangerous. I am the voice of the streets." The chapter ends with Markjus being sent back to his cell after another interrogation. He has almost lost faith in the possibility of justice, but something important awakens inside him: determination. He decides to use everything he has: his music, his power, and his belief that the truth will prevail. Scraps of song lyrics appear on the walls of the cell, lines written in his hand that become symbols of his inner struggle. His last look before the door closes is captured on an old smartphone recording: his new track, the words and melody, woven with pain and hope, become a vow. "I'll fight until I'm free." The day after Marcus's arrest, there was an uproar in Chicago. The news swept social media and television. Headlines and blogs described events that shook the neighborhood and the city's entire music community. Marcus Brayson arrested on suspicion of shooting. Street star or criminal? Chicago was in turmoil. Injustice or truth? Social media explodes with commentary. These headlines were full of sensationalism, bias and questions. For some, they were proof that the streets were no longer protecting their children. For others, it was an opportunity to see the truth about racially biased policing. There was a veritable riot of emotion in Markjus' neighborhood. Residents, many of whom knew him personally, were in shock. They saw him as an example that it was possible to break out of ghetto life, succeed and inspire others. Now their hero found himself at the center of an arrest. Mrs. Joanna, the neighbor who once fed Markjus cookies, sat on her stoop and wiped away tears. He was a good guy. Why did they arrest him? Why? She sobbed. Other neighbors gathered in the streets and discussed what had happened. We saw him so many times. He was working in the studio, doing something useful for the neighborhood, said Jamal, an older boy from a neighboring street. However, not everyone shared their views. There were comments online that sounded suspicious. Could he really have done something? Who knows what was in there? We need to get to the bottom of this. Let them check every last thing. Public opinion was split. People doubted who was the victim and who was the perpetrator. Social media exploded with discussion. Millions of comments, memes and videos filled the feeds of Instagram, Twitter and TikTok. The division of opinion was clear. Some supported Markjus, believing him to be a victim of the system, while others doubted his innocence. Videos of fans reacting, young people on the streets of Chicago holding placards reading "Free Marcus," shouted his name. Others, in the comments, argued, "Don't protect the criminal, you have to act according to the law." Markjus saw it all through the screen of his cell phone and the camera. The comments, the videos, the photos, all were a reminder to him that his own people were now divided. "It's not true," he whispered in the darkness of the cell. "I'm not what they think I am." Meanwhile, at the police station, discussions and investigations were marked by bias and a desire to avoid unnecessary effort. Detectives and officers discussed Markjus behind closed doors, debating how best to present the case to the press. "We need to close this case quickly," said Hansen, the senior detective. "If we show that we've done it, it'll be all right. Let it be exactly what we say it will be." "You mean without the extra scrutiny and extra work?" Miller asked. "That's right. We know who the real player is," Hansen replied. "Let's keep it simple. Let Markjus be the one people fear and hate right away." They were simply looking for the culprit, without thinking that their actions could ruin the life of a man who was once a symbol of success for many. Every comment on social media, every article in the newspapers, every entry in his friends' phones, it was all a blow to Markjus' soul. He felt that his own name had become a battlefield. "Why do they believe I'm a criminal? Why do they all think I could do something like this?" he asked himself, his voice trembling with despair. But his soul was not only in despair. He began to realize that he now had an opportunity to speak out about what was happening in the neighborhood, about what it means to be black in Chicago, about what it means to fight for the right to life and dignity in a system that is often biased. The chapter ends with a scene where Markjus, sitting in the corner of the cell, pulls out an old notebook in which he used to write down the lyrics to his songs. He writes the lines, "I am the voice of the streets. I am not a criminal. I am truth and light. I fear nothing. The system may fall, people may doubt, but I'll stay. I'll fight for the truth." He folds the notebook and puts it under the mattress. His eyes burn with determination, and his heart fills with music again, the same music that once lifted him from the streets and made him a star. This music has now become his weapon, a voice of struggle and faith that he is willing to use to show the world that truth will prevail. Marcus's attorney, Tamara Wright, was a woman in her mid-30s, but already experienced in defending the rights of Chicagoans. She was known for her persistence and determination to get justice, even when it seemed impossible. She was small in stature, with a hard stare and a fiery energy in her voice. To her, Marcus was more than just a client. He was a symbol of the fight for truth and justice in the neighborhood she knew and loved. Tamara knew that Markjus was innocent, but in a system where every step could be a battle, where racial stereotypes determined the outcome of an investigation, her job was difficult and dangerous. In the first hours after her arrest, Tamara went to the neighborhood where the shooting occurred to search for the videotapes. She went from one store to another, from house to house, meeting wary glances from residents who at first did not believe her intentions. "I need access to the cameras. Do you have cameras?" she asked small store owners. One owner, a man named Khalid, was showing her his camera with trembling hands. "Here, I saw that Marcus guy. He was walking by at 9 o'clock at night, but he was just walking. He wasn't involved in anything. I saw it, but the police just won't look that way." Tamara wrote down everything the witnesses said, collected their statements, and copied the camera footage. Each recording was a small piece of the puzzle that could reveal the truth. She sent all the notes to her colleague, a private investigations detective, Dennis Pierce. He was known for his insight and tenacity. "If there's truth here, we'll find it," Daniel said, reviewing the notes on the old laptop. In one of the videos, he saw Markjus walking down the street, perfectly calm, with headphones in his ears. He doesn't run away. He doesn't make any strange movements. His steps are confident. There is no hint of suspicious behavior. "It's an alibi. We need to take this to court and show everyone that Markjus is innocent of anything," Daniel continued. Meanwhile, the police station began to work to protect its reputation. The officers tried to defend their version of events at any cost. They were keen for the case to be closed quickly and any mistakes to be covered up. Detective Hansen, standing in his office, spoke to the other officers. "If these tapes show up in court, we need to make their veracity questionable. We need to test those cameras. Maybe they've been damaged." Hansen was not prepared to admit his mistakes, much less admit that the police were wrong in their version of events. For him, it was a matter of pride and professional dignity. Officer Miller, young and ambitious, looked at the computer screen. "We need more evidence to support the theory that Markjus was involved in something. It may not be a perfect investigation, but we need to show that the law is on our side." Thus, police work was characterized by laziness and simplification of procedures. Camera checks were carried out without proper scrutiny. Witnesses were subjected to cursory questions, and evidence was falsified and cross-checked only when critically needed. Tamara Wright worked closely with Daniel Pierce and the other attorneys, gathering all the information and analyzing the records. Each of their meetings was intense and filled with detail. "We can use every video as evidence," Tamara said. "We need to show the court that Markjus was just a passerby, a regular guy who had nothing to do with the shooting." Her legal team sent requests to law enforcement offices, demanding all possible video footage. However, many of them simply ignored the requests or responded with excuses. "They don't want to see the truth," Daniel said, flipping through the papers frustratedly. "It's easier for them to make Markjus look like a criminal than to be honest about the details." In his cell, Markjus waited daily for news from the lawyers. Each visit was a mixture of hope and fear. "We'll find the truth, brother," Daniel told him as they talked through the glass. But a sense of helplessness was growing inside Markjus. He saw everything he had built crumbling around him. His music, his support in the neighborhood, all became the backdrop for his fight for justice. "Why do they want to destroy me? Why do I have to prove that I'm not a criminal?" he asked himself. Markjus jotted down song lines filled with desperation and determination in his old notebook. "I stand for truth, for the voice of the streets, for the power in music, for life and light." The chapter ends with attorney Tamara Wright sending all the collected records to the court. She is going to act as Markjus' chief defense attorney, preparing for the trial, which will be the arena of a battle for justice. She knows there are more challenges ahead of them. But now, after all the recorded evidence and testimonies, she has hope that the camera is not lying, and the truth is something they intend to defend at all costs. On the streets of Chicago, in the eyes of neighbors and Markjus fans, hopes were rippling that justice would be served. The prison doors creaked open, opening the way to freedom, but for Markjus it was not liberation, but a new nightmare. He paced the pavement with his shoes shod and his face tired from the struggle. The warm summer wind caressed his face, but he didn't feel it. As he stepped outside, his heart began to beat faster. He heard voices, glances that were directed in his direction, but he couldn't understand their true meaning. "There he is, Marcus Brayson," whispered someone behind me. Those words made Markjus feel a chill in his stomach. He turned around and saw the guy from the neighboring street. His eyes were full of suspicion and hatred. On the street corner stood Jamal, a neighbor, A guy who had once admired Markjus and seen him as an example of success, now Jamal was averting his eyes to the side. "Hello, Jamal," Markjus said hello, trying to smile, but Jamal averted his gaze and continued on his way without answering. This scene was like a stab in the heart. Markjus felt that something had broken in his connection to the neighborhood. People who had once been his supporters were now whispering behind his back or avoiding his gaze. More and more he felt that the streets that had been home to him had become a hostile space. The system of bias had destroyed the trust he had spent so long building. In the evening, Marcus was returning home to his old apartment. He sat down on the mattress, wrapping his arms around his head. The room was the same as before, but now it seemed like a dark place where he felt cheated and betrayed. "I did the right thing. Why don't they believe me?" he whispered. Markjus recalled all those moments when he wrote lyrics and made songs about struggle, hope and strength. His music was his voice that had inspired many, showing that it was possible to overcome hardship, but now he was unsure if his lyrics made sense. "The system isn't fair. It uses us as pawns in its game," he said aloud, looking at an old notebook of lyrics. His hands shook with anger and frustration. That night, Marcus could not sleep. He thought about his future, the police, the neighborhood, the fans. They were all variables in this new reality now. He couldn't get his old life back, but he couldn't accept this condition either. Marcus recalled conversations in prison with other inmates who told him about a system that was biased and working against them, but he could not let that system win. "If I give up now, I will betray everyone who believed in me," he thought. His inner voice began to conflict. "You're the star of the streets, the voice of the struggle. You can't lose, you have to act," he reminded himself. But at the same time, another voice in his head doubted. What if the system is stronger? What if you end up back in prison? What if no one supports you? The next day, Marcus went out on the street. He went to the studio where he used to work, the place where his music career started. Here he met an old friend, Justin, who was a backing vocalist on his crew. "Markjus, I'm glad you came out, but it's different now, man," Justin said. "Yeah, I can see that. People have stopped believing me, but I can't just walk away. We have to do something to show them the truth," Markjus replied. Justin put his arm around him. "You and me, bro, we need to write a song, a real song that will tell everything about pain, about the system, about betrayal and loyalty, a voice that everyone can hear." This idea inspired Markjus. He decided to create a track that would become an anthem of struggle, a symbol of truth and resilience. The chapter ends with a scene of Markjus standing in a studio, in front of a microphone. The fire he has lost appears in his eyes. He begins to write lyrics for a new song that will become not just music, but a weapon in the battle for justice. Every word he writes down carries with it the power of struggle, the belief in change and the willingness to stand up for the truth at any cost. Markjus knows that the road ahead will not be easy, but now he's realized he can't give up. His music is not just art, it's a weapon that can change everything. Marcus could no longer sit idly by. He felt that if he did not take steps towards justice, his whole life would be ruined forever. He began to study his rights, read books about justice, and looked at court cases that dealt with similar cases. Every morning he woke up feeling like he had a weight on his shoulders, and if he didn't lift it, no one would. In his years in the music industry, he had learned to fight for his ideas, but this was something new. He never thought that one day his life would depend on him standing up for his freedom. "I can't just keep quiet," he thought, browsing the pages of internet forums. "I have to fight for my honor, for my life, for my name." He knew it wasn't going to be easy, and not just because the case was against the police. It meant that the whole system would stand against him. But Marcus was ready for it. He was ready to fight for justice, even if it meant a long, hard road. The initial steps were the hardest. Every day he went to the offices of lawyers, telling his story, looking for those who believed in his case. At first, he encountered excuses, rejections. Many did not want to get involved with the police, with those who might hold back their careers. "It's too dangerous. You're against the system itself," said one lawyer, closing the case file. "We can't take that risk." But Marcus didn't give up. He knew the truth was on his side. His faith in it was so strong that nothing could shake it. Then, after a week of searching, he met Greg Holder, a lawyer who had experience fighting government agencies. "I can't promise it will be easy," Greg said when they met at the cafe, "But I believe you're right. We will fight." Greg explained to him that suing the police is a serious step. Courts tend to put the interests of law enforcement above the rights of citizens, but Mark just knew he had to go all the way. He could have given up, but his conscience wouldn't let him. "We'll do it," Greg said, "but be prepared. It's going to be a long journey." Meanwhile, while Markjus was dealing with the legal side of the case, a real movement was brewing in the streets of Chicago. People who had once seen him as an inspiration began to speak out in his favor. Protests became more and more widespread, and placards began to appear on the streets that read, "Free Markjus, no to racism and the police, people's rights are more important." At first it was small groups, but within a few weeks the number of people at the rallies increased. It was not only young people from his neighborhood, but also the older generation, and even people from other parts of the city who were familiar with the stories of injustice and abuse of power. Markjus himself was surprised by the number of people who supported him. He was increasingly in the news, his name becoming synonymous with the fight for justice. The protesters came out with flags, banners and loud slogans, and they all shouted one word: justice. Amanda Jackson, an activist and founder of a local human rights group, became a leading figure in the protests. She often addressed the crowds, urging people to unite for Markjus and for all those suffering from systemic racism. "We must all fight for the truth, for Markjus, for every person who is oppressed in this system," Amanda shouted, her words penetrating everyone's hearts. Markjus sometimes joined in these protests, though he wasn't sure how he was perceived by people now. His face still bore the stamp of stress and pain, but each protest, each activist speech, added to his strength. He realized that this was not just his struggle, but the struggle of all those who had ever been victims of racial prejudice and violence at the hands of the authorities. The rallies became increasingly emotional. People were not only demanding justice for Markjus, but also protesting against everything that was happening in their lives. The voices of the protesters sounded like songs of anger, like cries for freedom. "The system can't hear us. We are the power that can change everything," were shouting in the crowd. Markjus watched it all from afar. Standing on the roof of his house, he was touched. His people, his neighborhood, had not forgotten about him. Every rally, every action was proof that he was not alone. He felt more and more that his cause was not just his struggle, but the struggle of all those who had been ignored and wronged by the system. The crowd in the streets was becoming a powerful movement. The rallies were not just demanding justice for Markjus, they were demanding change for the whole of society. People began collecting signatures for reforms in law enforcement, for the creation of independent commissions that would investigate racism and violence. Markjus felt the fear and doubt begin to fade away. He was on the verge of something more than just a personal victory. He felt that he was now part of something much more meaningful than his own life. The protests had become not only his movement, but a movement for all those who had once been suppressed. The chapter ends with Markjus, accompanied by Greg's lawyer, going to court to file a lawsuit against the police. Along with him go the activists, and the last rallies down the street with the protesters performing a song he wrote specifically in support of Markjus. This was the moment when everything he had dreamed of became a reality. The fight for justice was beginning. The Chicago courthouse was massive and cold, symbolizing the bureaucratic and unfeeling machinery of justice. The courtroom was crowded with people, friends of Markjus, activists, members of the press, and ordinary neighborhood residents who had come to support him. The air was tense and everyone's hearts beat in unison with excitement and anticipation. In the front row sat Markjus and his lawyer, Greg Holder. Markjus was wearing a simple white t-shirt and dark blue jeans, and his eyes were determined, but there was also a shadow of fear in them. The judge, gray-haired and imposing, walked to his desk, adjusted his glasses, and opened the courtroom. "Let's begin the proceedings in the case of Marcus Brayson," the judge said. Looking at the documents, the defendant is charged with participating in a crime that occurred on 47th Street near Center. "Let's begin." The prosecutor, Robert Fields, an older man with gray hair and sharp eyes, stood to the side of the prosecution. He looked confident and smiled almost contemptuously at Markjus. "Your Honor, the defendant was seen at the crime scene at the time of the shooting. We have evidence that points to his guilt," Fields stated confidently. A whisper went up in the audience. Greg Holder stood up and asked, "Tell me, prosecutor, did you take into account the surveillance videos that are in the area of the accident?" Fields grinned. These records are not reliable enough. We cannot consider them as the main evidence. But, Your Honor, these tapes clearly show that Markjus was elsewhere at the time of the crime. Greg was outraged. He unfolded the clipboard and showed the footage of Markjus and his friend Justin standing outside the studio at the time of the shooting. They were discussing a track they were going to record. But the prosecutor brushed off the evidence. The witnesses saw him. They can't be wrong, he replied firmly. Greg was furious, but kept his composure. The next minutes revealed details that had been hidden from the public. The testimonies of the lawyers began to show how the police fabricated evidence against Markjus. Greg presented a report from an independent expert who confirmed that the fingerprints found in the area of the crime did not belong to Markjus. Also shown was a phone message from a police officer discussing the urgency of finding the defendant, regardless of the true circumstances. It's called arbitrariness. It's not normal, Greg exclaimed in court. The prosecutor attempted to defend the police officers by bringing them into the room as witnesses. The police officers confidently recounted that Markjus was suspicious, that his behavior was unusual, and that the street where the shooting occurred was considered dangerous. We were just doing our duties, Officer Kelly, a young and confident man with a soulless stare, replied. He looked suspicious. Such behavior is common in this neighborhood. But Greg Holder stood up and asked bluntly, "What do you mean, suspicious? How exactly did it manifest itself? We have photographs and records that show that Markjus did not engage in any suspicious behavior. Why didn't you take that into account in your investigation?" The trial had become an arena where the personal was linked to the public, and justice was a matter of debate. Markjus sat in his chair and watched the policemen as they tried to justify themselves in any way they could. On the side of the defense were friends and residents of the area who told how Markjus was always helping out in the community, putting on free concerts for local children and writing lyrics about struggle and hope. "He was the voice of our neighborhood," Justin said, with tears in his eyes. "He inspired us by showing us that it was possible to overcome difficulties." These words shook many in the audience. Some of those present began to cry. Markjus felt that public support was strengthening his spirit, but he saw that the system slowly and stubbornly continued to resist. He realized that his attorneys had much more to fight than just a battle in this court. When the prosecutor and defense lawyers had finished their arguments, the judge rose and retired to deliver his decision. Silence reigned in the hall. Markjus looked into the eyes of his team and friends. He realized that this was no longer just his personal battle, it was a battle for the whole community. "For truth and justice. We will stand until the end," he told Justin. "We're not giving up," the friend replied. "We're gonna win, bro, for all of us." That determination spread through the courtroom like fire. Markjus was ready for the next step, knowing that more challenges lay ahead of them, but he felt that this was only the beginning of a journey that could lead to real change. The court's decision was announced on what could be considered a watershed day. After weeks of struggle and a lengthy trial, the judge handed down a verdict that shook the entire system. The police were found guilty of fabricating evidence and misconduct against Marcus Brayson. The court ordered him to pay $1 million in compensation and formally apologize. At first it looked like a victory. News spread throughout the city and beyond. It was in the papers and on TV. Communities that supported Markjus took to the streets to celebrate this victory. People cried tears of happiness because justice had been done, even if only in a small part of it. Greg Holder, Markjus' attorney, stood in front of a microphone downtown and said in his final statement, "This isn't just a victory for Markjus. This is a victory for everyone who has ever faced injustice. Today we showed that truth can win, even when the system tries to suppress it." Markjus felt relieved, but deep down it was a mixed feeling. He had been compensated, but justice was not complete. He still saw his life ruined, and his relationship with part of society was now strained. Previously, Markjus was a symbol of success and hope for many in his neighborhood. His music inspired, motivated and supported residents, but after his arrest and trial, attitudes towards him changed. Some people were now whispering behind their backs, discussing that Markjus might have been guilty of something after all. Prosecutors and their supporters were spreading rumors that he was simply trying to avoid responsibility. These rumors were destroying Markjus' reputation in the eyes of those who had previously believed in him. One day he met an old friend named Jeremy who worked at a local auto repair shop. "I heard you were involved in a crime," Jeremy said, his eyes full of doubt. "Maybe you should put it all behind you." Markjus replied, "Jeremy, you know me better than anyone. I couldn't have done that. I was there when it happened. These tapes show the truth." But Jeremy waved his hand away. "I really don't need all these posts. People talk, and their opinions change. You're not the same person you were." Markjus realized that even in his home district, his support was not as strong as it used to be. Close friends began to leave. Some stopped socializing. People who had once prided themselves on Markjus being their voice now doubted his integrity. After receiving financial compensation, Marcus began to realize an even deeper truth: justice in the system is rare. Money couldn't turn back the clock, couldn't mend the wounds on his soul, couldn't mend broken relationships. Attorney Greg Holder explained to him, "Money is not restoration, it is only compensation for damage, but the systemic problem remains. We won in court, but that's just a drop in the ocean. We need to change the system itself." These words filled Marcus's mind with doubts and fears. He realized that justice in the system was not an automatic result, but the result of hard struggle and activism. Markjus returned to his studio, where he used to record tracks inspired by life in the neighborhood and the struggles of his people, but now the studio was a place where he felt frustration and an inner emptiness. He sat at his guitar, its strings as tight as the nerves inside him. He tried to write a song about his struggle, but the words wouldn't come. Memories of being grabbed on the street, accused without cause, haunted him. Every line was drenched in pain and frustration. "Why does it have to be like this?" he whispered into the emptiness of the studio. "Why should the truth be so difficult to prove?" But then he felt the support of his friends and fans who had not given up on him completely. He remembered their faces at the protests and their voices in the rallies. These people still believed in him, and their faith became a new purpose for him. Although the court victory was a step forward, Marcus realized that his real battle was just beginning. Now he was fighting not only for himself, but for all those who had been suppressed by the system, for those who could not speak for themselves. He realized that music could be a powerful weapon in this struggle. He decided to write a new track that would tell the truth about what was happening, about police bias and their unjust actions. "If I can use my music to fight for the truth, I will," he thought, deciding to pick up his guitar. Markjus was no longer just a musician. He was now a symbol of the struggle for justice, a voice that could be heard in any part of the city and beyond. Marcus Brayson sat in his studio. The walls were hung with photographs, moments from the past, when he was young and full of dreams, when music was the only language he knew that could speak for him. Now every corner of that studio was a reminder of the trauma and pain he had endured over the past months. But today there was a fire burning in his eyes, the fire he had found within himself after all the trials. He felt that now, through music, he could say what he could not say with words. He turned on the guitar and began strumming the strings. His fingers trembled a little, but there was a strength inside him that he had never felt before. He was going to create a track called Chains of Justice, a song that would talk about injustice, the bias of the system, and how a person could be broken but not defeated. Marcus took a deep breath and began to write lines. "In the chains of justice I was found, but the truth was in my hands. With words I broke those fetters. My voice is a fire, it's a blow." Each word was like a hammer blow to his soul. He remembered the streets where he had been captured, the face of the officers who had tried to suppress him. He felt like this song was not just a track, but a cry from his heart that needed to be heard. Standing in the studio was Greg Holder, his lawyer, who was now not only a defense attorney but a friend. He watched Markjus play a melody on the guitar, recording the first demos. "It's more than a song, Markjus," Greg said. "It's a manifesto, a voice that can inspire people to change." Marcus nodded, his eyes filled with determination. Recording Chains of Justice was difficult and emotional. Markjus couldn't just perform the track, he put all his pain, frustration and hatred for the system that wanted to break him into it. Every line was a record of his own struggle. He finished the last recording in the studio deep in the night. Sweat ran down his forehead, his breathing was heavy. "This is my voice, this is my answer to the world," he whispered into the microphone. The engineers in the studio nodded in support. They realized that this wasn't just music, this was a revolution in sound. When the song was ready, Markjus decided to present it in an outdoor venue downtown, in the very neighborhood where he grew up. He organized a small event, inviting locals, activists, fans and everyone who once believed in him. There was a microphone on the stage, When the first chords of Chains of Justice began to play, the silence in the crowd was tense. People stared at Markjus, their eyes full of anticipation. When he sang, "In the chains of justice I was found, but the truth was in my hands," the crowd burst into applause. People began to sing along, their voices merging into a powerful chorus. It wasn't just a song, it was an anthem that united everyone. Markjus saw tears in the eyes of many. This song was for those who had lost loved ones, for those who had been arrested for no reason, for those who struggled every day to survive in the face of injustice. Shortly after the premiere, the song Chains of Justice went viral all over the internet and radio. Musicians and celebrities supported Marcus by inviting him to talk shows and raising issues of racial bias in the music industry and society at large. "You're the voice of a generation, Markjus," he was told in interviews. Marcus felt that this victory was not complete. The public success was gratifying, but he saw that the system still had its shadows. He faced criticism from those who said he was too aggressive in his songs, too direct in his lyrics. But Marcus knew he couldn't back down. Now Markjus decided to use his platform for more. He began collaborating with activists and organizing benefit concerts where all proceeds went to organizations supporting victims of police violence. He wrote songs about hope and change, inspiring young people to be voices of change. He realized that music was his tool, but not his only tool. He began teaching young people how they could use the arts to fight for their rights and justice. Marcus saw that every success and every performance brought him closer to a mission that was much more than a personal struggle. It was a struggle for change in society, for a future in which everyone could live freely and honestly. Marcus Brayson was no longer just a musician, he was a symbol of the struggle for justice, a voice from the ashes that inspired and united. He knew the road ahead was difficult, but he was ready to go all the way, with music in his heart and truth in his voice. When the song Chains of Justice by Marcus Brayson made its way into people's hearts, it became much more than just a track. It became a symbol of the fight for justice and equality. The words and tune began to be heard across the country, from New York to Los Angeles, Chicago to Miami. People heard in it the truth and strength they were looking for. Social media and social networks began to show videos of rallies where crowds of people sang a line from the song. Black youth in major cities and suburbs used it to protest against racial discrimination. Whites and African Americans sang the song together, uniting against a system that tried to divide them. People in Los Angeles held up placards, "Justice for all, Chains of Justice. Marcus is the voice of our struggle." Each new chord of this song gave them strength and faith that change was possible. Markjus has been invited to appear on famous TV shows and radio programs. His appearance on live TV programs attracted millions of viewers. In one such broadcast, he spoke with popular host Michael Turner. "You've become a symbol of the struggle, Marcus. How are you coping with all this?" Michael asked. Markjus replied, "My pain is the pain of many. I know that injustice is not just my challenge. It is a challenge for anyone who has ever felt their voice ignored. I am not alone. We are all in this together." His words resonated with people across the country. Radio stations began putting Chains of Justice on the air during prime time. The song became the anthem of human rights movements, motivating new activists and symbolizing solidarity. Social media became a key tool for spreading the song. Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, all platforms were filled with videos of people dancing to the song, creating creative videos and discussing issues of racial discrimination. Marcus himself began live streaming on Instagram, where he interacted with fans and activists from around the country. "We must unite," he said on air, "not only in struggle, but also in love, in mutual assistance. Each of us can be a voice for change." His account attracted tens of thousands of followers, and the comments were full of gratitude and support. People wrote to him, "You have shown that the truth can win. Thank you for the strength you have given us. We are together." Marcus, for justice. Marcus began working with various activist groups around the country, organizing rallies and concerts. He personally participated in rallies where the song Chains of Justice was played to the roar of the crowd. These events became places of gathering and support. In Washington, D.C., in the heart of the city, there was a large-scale action in which about 20,000 people participated. People from different races and cultures stood shoulder to shoulder, holding placards and chanting the words of the song. Markjus took the stage in the center of the crowd and sang the first line, "In the chains of justice I was found, Emotions were so strong that tears streamed down the faces of those in the crowd. Here, Marcus felt that his personal story was no longer just his pain, it became a collective experience, an experience of struggle and hope. Markjus continued to write new tracks. Each song was now an expression of struggle, hope and challenge. He created songs about solidarity, justice and equality, making his studio a place where activists and youth could gather, record tracks and share stories. One day, a group of young musicians from other Chicago neighborhoods came to him. They wanted to record a song about their neighborhood and the challenges they faced. Markjus realized that he was no longer just a musician, but a mentor and a guide. We have to do more than just music. We have to speak the truth, join forces and inspire each other to change, he said. Markjus initiated projects to support young talents and activists. He organized concerts where each speaker spoke about their community's problems, hope and struggles. Marcus realized that this struggle would not end until the system changed completely. He saw it as a challenge as well as a mission. His personal pain was no longer a weakness, it was the basis for strength, for the music that was now his weapon in defense. Now he was fighting not only for himself, but for all those who could not speak, for those who faced injustice every day, for those who lost their loved ones and dreams. Marcus became the face of the movement, a symbol of the struggle for rights and justice, but he knew that this was only the beginning. "We are moving on," he said in an interview. "The voice must be heard more strongly, truth must be heard, justice must win." After all the trials and triumphs, Marcus decided that his mission must continue onward. He started a foundation called Chains of Freedom, which became a place of support and inspiration for youth. The foundation's goal was simple but powerful: to provide resources and opportunities for those who dreamed but faced barriers and challenges. The foundation organized music workshops, opened studios in troubled areas, and provided scholarships for young talent. Marcus personally organized meetings and classes, telling young people that their voice matters and can change the world. He continued to collaborate with other musicians and activists, inviting them to participate in projects and actions. Now every track recorded in the studio was not just art, but an act of resistance and support. "Art is not only sound," Marcus said in his speeches, "it is a weapon, it is a bridge, it is a force that unites us. Your voices can change the future." Marcus began speaking at events ranging from universities and public squares to large conferences and rallies. His words were heartfelt and made people think about justice and equality. At a conference in Washington, D.C., he spoke to a group of students. "I was imprisoned in chains, but now I am free," he said. "My pain was my prison, but now it has become my wings. I want each of you to know that you are not alone. Together we will create a world where everyone has the right to life, dreams and freedom." The youth in the audience raised their hands, many crying with emotion. "Use your power, your faith and your talents to speak the truth," Markjus continued. "Each of you is a step toward change." Markjus continued to write music, but now each song was a challenge, a hope and a challenge to the system. His new tracks like Rise Up Strong and Voices Unbroken reflected struggle and resilience. In the song Rise Up Strong, he wrote, "Stand strong, break the chains. Don't let fear take over. Our voices are strength, they are light. We're together in the fight, together until the end." This song has become a symbol of a new generation united by ideas of justice and solidarity. It was heard on the streets, in public actions and in every corner of the country, inspiring people to take action. Markjus found the strength to not only meet the challenges, but also to help others. He visited shelters, spoke to families who had lost loved ones to violence. He supported those who wanted to become musicians but didn't have opportunities. One day, a girl named Amira from Chicago approached him. She was a talented songwriter, but she felt lost in a world where justice was rare. "Markjus, I want to do something more than just music," she said. "Your music is your voice. It can be a force for change," Marcus replied. Amira became involved with the Chains of Freedom Foundation, running workshops and writing texts that told the truth about neighborhood life and the struggle for equality. Over time, Marcus became not only a musician, but also a symbol of the struggle for justice. He united people across the country, those who dreamed, those who fought, and those who would no longer tolerate injustice. At his final concert in Chicago, he stood on stage in front of thousands of people. He He looked into the eyes of those who had come, those who had supported him through the hard times. My pain was my prison, but now it has become my wings, he said into the microphone. The crowd chanted in response, "We are together, we are strength." These words were not just slogans, they meant bringing people together to fight, believing in change and the power of art as a tool of resistance. Markjus raised his hand in victory. He didn't just survive, he transformed his story into a powerful symbol of change. Let's continue the journey forward, together, until justice becomes a reality for all, he concluded. Marcus Brayson was no longer just a musician from Chicago, he became a voice that inspired millions, a symbol of struggle and faith. His personal trials became the foundation for the change that swept the country. The way forward is not just a movement, it's a mission, Markjus thought as he walked back to his studio. Now every chord, every line, every new track was an extension of his mission. He knew there were still many challenges ahead, but his words were clear and strong. My pain was my prison, but now it has become my wings. And with that, he continued to fly forward, inspiring, making music and bringing justice to every corner of the world. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.